Hello students. In today's class, I am going to talk about endurance, its concept, types, factors and the methods of training endurance. Let's start with an introduction of the topic. Training is a process of preparation for some task. Sports training is a pedagogical process based on scientific principles, aiming at preparing sportspersons for higher performances in sports competitions. Sports training is also essential to understand the meaning of the terms conditioning and coaching. Conditioning is a process of gradually preparing the body for strenuous physical activity, thus focusing on development of physical and motor fitness components that comprises of strength, endurance, speed, flexibility, coordinative abilities, and directly enhancing sports performance. Now let us look at the concept of the term endurance. Endurance, like strength, is a conditional ability. It is primarily determined by energy liberation processes. The ability of the human body to maintain a certain level of energy production forms the physiological basis of endurance. Due to its high importance for health and training and competition, and also due to its physiological determinants, which can be relatively easily studied, it is an ability which has been studied in great detail and depth by the physiologists. Endurance is characterized by the maintenance of working capacity and by the degree of resistance of the organism against fatigue and against the influence of unfavorable environmental conditions. It is also characterized by the pace of recovery after a tiresome activity. Having understood the concept, let us now talk about the different types of endurance. Endurance can be classified based on the nature of activity and the duration of activity. Keeping in mind the nature of the activity, endurance can be classified into the following four types: basic endurance, speed endurance, sprint endurance, and strength endurance. Let us first discuss about the first form of endurance, that is basic endurance. It is the ability of the organism to resist against fatigue. In the case of endurance, basic endurance includes loads of medium intensity of stimulus and mainly aerobic muscular metabolism. For example, jogging, swimming, walking at a moderate speed for periods lasting more than 30 minutes. For sedentary and untrained persons, the duration can be significantly less. As the activity is done at low pace, that is below anaerobic threshold, the energy is supplied predominantly by aerobic process of energy liberation. Due to this fact, it is also referred to as aerobic endurance. However, the term basic endurance is better as it reflects better the psychomotor nature of this ability better. Basic endurance activities do not result in appreciable lactic acid concentrations in the blood. Now let us talk about the second form of endurance, that is speed endurance. It is the ability of the organism to resist against fatigue. In the case of speed endurance, It comprises loads of sub-maximum intensity of stimulus and mainly anaerobic gaining of energy and maximum loss of oxygen. This ability is required for cyclic activities lasting up to 45 seconds. The 400-meter sprint in track and field is a classical example of speed endurance ability. This ability is highly dependent on the power and capacity of glycolytic mechanism of energy production. The phosphogens lactic acid metabolism also contributes significantly towards energy production. Glycolysis results in very high amount of lactic acid concentration in the muscles and as a result is one of the dominant fatigue producing factors in such activities. Very high amount of oxygen depth is recorded in speed endurance activities. A highly developed activity of the muscles to continue contracting with required speed and force. Other high lactic acid concentration is a primary prerequisite for good performance in speed endurance activities. Next is sprint endurance. Sprint endurance again is the ability of the organism to resist against fatigue during endurance. Sprint endurance requires loads of maximum intensity and motor frequency. Last form of endurance is strength endurance. It is the ability of the muscle to get over resistance. In the case of strength endurance, loads of medium intensity of the stimulus is required for as long time as possible. Keeping in mind the duration of different games and sports, endurance can be classified into the following three types. First is short time endurance. This ability is required for cyclic activities which last from 45 seconds to 2 minutes. These activities result in high amount of lactic acid concentration in the blood and muscles. To perform well in short time endurance activities, speed endurance and strength endurance are important prerequisites. Examples of short time endurance are 400 meters run, 800 meters run, few events of swimming, selective combative sports namely wrestling, judo, etc. Second categorization is middle time endurance. This ability is needed for cyclic activities continuing between 2 to 8 minutes. In this activity also, there is a high amount of lactic acid concentration in the blood and muscles. Speed endurance and strength are important motor components required for good performance. Examples can be 1500 meters run, 3000 meters run, few events in swimming, selected combative activities, etc. The third and the last form is long time endurance. This ability is essential for all games and sports and activities continuing for more than 8 minutes. For long time endurance activities, the main source of energy is the glycogen stored in the muscles and the liver. Energy is produced by the oxidation of glycogen. For activities continuing up to 30 minutes, energy production is achieved from oxidation of glycogen. Whereas, for activities lasting for more than 30 minutes, the energy is produced as a result of fat metabolism. As the duration of activity increases, the production of lactic acid in the muscles and blood reduces. Examples can be long distance events in track and field and swimming, racket games, kabaddi, kho-kho, etc. Now let us discuss about the factors determining endurance. Endurance is a motor ability which has been a subject of keen study by experts of sports physiology. As a result, we have a much better insight into the factors and prerequisites which determine endurance ability. But the study of psychic factors of endurance is still lagging behind. The study of psychic aspects of endurance is crucial for further improvements of endurance performances. Endurance ability depends upon the following factors. First is the aerobic capacity. To enable a person to continue an activity for a prolonged time, continuous flow of oxygen has to be ensured to the working muscle for the liberation of energy. The aerobic capacity of a person can be measured by the maximum amount of oxygen consumed by the working muscles in 1 minute, which is referred to as VO2 max. For endurance activity, a continuous flow of oxygen has to be ensured to the muscle cells for the liberation of energy. The human body gets oxygen from the atmosphere and is then transported to the muscles where it is consumed. But as energy liberation has to be continued for long periods, therefore, the energy reserves are also important constituents of aerobic capacity. Next is the anaerobic capacity. Anaerobic capacity is the ability of the organism to perform an activity in the absence of oxygen. For these activities, energy production comes either from the breakdown of phosphogens, that is adenosine triphosphate and creatine phosphate, or from glycolysis of muscle glycogen. In the muscles, the total amount of stored phosphogens is only sufficient for activities with maximum intensity lasting up to 8 or 10 seconds. Hence, a lacticid mechanism is of crucial importance for speed performances. The anaerobic capacity is required to a lesser or greater extent for all sports performances, depending on endurance. Even in long-time endurance activities, the anaerobic capacity is needed for the sudden bursts of short duration at the beginning or end or in between. The next factor determining endurance is the economy of movement. All the movements are to be efficiently executed and unwanted movements are to be avoided so that activities are performed with minimum expenditure of energy. To achieve this, complete technical efficiency is to be ensured. In some endurance sports like long distance swimming, rowing, cycling, etc., the role of technique for energy conservation assumes very high significance. In these sports, poor technique leads to a lot of energy wastage, thereby markedly affecting the performance. The last factor that affects endurance is psychological factors. The contribution of psychic factors towards endurance performance can hardly be overestimated. Endurance performances, because of high degree of fatigue involved, are always a result of sportsmen's fight and resistance against the uncomfortable and painful sensations and feelings which are inevitable part of endurance activity. For endurance performance, certain psychological factors, namely motivation, willpower, ability to tolerate pain and discomfort, etc., are also important in enabling a sportsperson to continue activity for a prolonged period in addition to the physiological factors. These qualities of head and heart are important for endurance competition as well as for endurance training. Endurance athletes are characterized by qualities of hard work, perseverance, determination, and by a distinct type of temperament and personality. Fortunately, many of the psychic factors important for good endurance performance can be significantly improved through training and other means. Now let us discuss about the methods of endurance training. There are many different types of methods in endurance training. The first method is duration of load method. This training method includes those methods of endurance training in which uninterrupted medium of sub-maximum intensity loads are maintained for a relatively longer period of time. Within this duration load method, there are several other methods. They are constant method, Fartlek method, and the alternating method. So let's come to constant method first. This method involves continuous loads administered for a long period of time. In as much as the loads are continued for a long time, the intensity of running is low. This method has three variations. First is the slow constant method. Second is fast constant method. And thirdly, varied pace method. Next, we will be talking about Fartlek method. Fartlek is a Swedish term meaning speed play. This method was developed in Scandinavia to provide an alternative to constant running. It is used to describe cross-country runs where the steady speed of ordinary cross-country running is changed into a mixture of faster and slower phases, each covering a different distance over natural terrain according to the individual approach of the sportsperson. The change of intensity is done depending upon the surface of running, surroundings, condition of the sportsperson, climate, and the like. This method is effective for developing both aerobic and anaerobic capacities of the sportsperson. Next, we will be talking about alternating method. In this method of endurance training also, the load is uninterrupted, but the intensity of running is changed. The change of intensity is fixed by the coach. In view of the fact that intensity of running and its change is planned by the coach, this method has not become very popular. Now let us come to the second method of endurance training, that is interval running method. It is perhaps the most versatile method of endurance training, which involves repeated efforts at a relatively faster pace, separated by measured intervals of incomplete recovery. The intensity of each bout of running should be such that the heart rate increases from normal to between 170 to 180 beats per minute. The bouts of loads are repeated when the heart rate comes down from the above value to about 120 beats per minute. The training load method is best maintained by relatively checking the heart rate. The third method for endurance training is the repetition training method. This method involves loads of high intensity ranging in between 90% to 100% of stimulus separated by intervals of complete recovery. It is considered as the best method for developing speed endurance and pace judgment. This method enhances anaerobic capacity, thus improving the phosphagen stores, lactic acid tolerance and non-oxidative enzymes. The last method for endurance training is the competition and test method. Endurance performances depends upon experience, tactical efficiency and psychic factors. They can be improved through participation in competitions. Test and time trial are also good for specific endurance. And finally, to conclude today's discussion, endurance is an important component of various conditional abilities, skills and tactical actions. Exercises involving competitive movements and done with additional weights, example hurdling with weight jacket on, kicking in soccer balls with ankle weight collars, etc. Endurance loads cause numerous changes in the functions and structure of the organism. These changes refer to the performance of heart, the circulatory system, respiration, metabolism, hormonal system and biochemical changes in the muscle cells. Endurance enables sportspersons to successfully complete training schedules of higher loads. With this, we conclude the topic. Thank you.